Hi, it's Jerry Roberts, back with our series of community conversations. And today we are delighted to have former Mayor Sheila Lodge with us. She was the first woman to serve as mayor of Santa Barbara and the longest serving mayor in the history of Santa Barbara. And her terms as mayor were bookended by service on the Planning Commission, where she now still serves, as well as a number of terms on the city council. And she is the world's leading authority on the history of planning matters in Santa Barbara. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So you have written a monograph, which is called An Uncommonplace American Town about Santa Barbara, but it's a personal view. Can you talk a little bit about the project and how it came about?
It came about because I acquired a guidebook to Santa Barbara that was published in 1941 that had in it a quote that, that really caught my eye. The old landmarks and most charming characteristics of Santa Barbara are disappearing, excuse me, before the march of, quote, improvement, unquote. Though our practical people cannot move the mountains, change the climate, or alter the seas, they are doing all they can to turn Santa Barbara into a commonplace American town.
And that was when?
That was what made my jaw drop. 1874, not 1974.
So 150 years ago, almost. It's
yeah, and you know, I knew that Santa Barbara had a long history of community activism around how it would develop, and great concern about preserving the high quality of life we're lucky enough to enjoy here. Largely, a lot of it because of people who came before us who also cared, and so I decided to start looking into it. You know, how did this come about?
And how long did it take you to put this together? How much research was involved?
How many? Well, I started about 15 years ago because one of the, excuse me, I'm going to have to take it off.
Sure.
I'm meant to do this before events that changed the direction of planning in Santa Barbara occurred in 1973 with an election of a slate of candidates that were environmentally concerned. Before that, the members of the council had been insurance salesmen, realtors, a dry cleaner owner, someone who owned a business on State Street. And they didn't have a very broad picture. They were pretty parochial lot. So I wanted to know how that came about. And some of the people who had been involved in that were still alive at that time. Like one of the key figures was a council member named Niall Utterback. So I decided I better start interviewing those people before they were no longer available to interview. So that's where I started, but then that started way back. Then I started filing it about.
Yeah.
I interviewed all the people I could think of, and then I started going through the Planning Commission minutes, parts of the City Council minutes, old newspapers. It was fun in a way. It was surprising in some ways what I learned.
Yeah.
And one of the things I learned that it's extremely difficult to be accurate. One of the things that I wanted to be.
Yeah, tell me about it. So I read it, and it, you know, for anyone who's interested in the history of Santa Barbara or planning in Santa Barbara or the future of Santa Barbara, I would be well advised to read it. It's fascinating stuff, and it filled in a lot of gaps in my knowledge. I've only been here 20 years, so that's not surprising. But one of the things that struck me is that there have been a series of inflection points. Santa Barbara was one of the, you write is distinctive, and then it took charge of planning its future earlier than most American cities, and that was right after the turn of the century, either in early 20th century. And certainly Kachuma was an important event. The earthquake in 1925, the coming of La Cumbre Plaza. At all these points, the city sort of took stock and decided about what it wanted to be. Now we have this pandemic and economic shutdown, which has really shaken things up. Do you see any event in the history of Santa Barbara that is as profound in perhaps changing the direction that we're going to go?
I think as far as Santa Barbara's economy is concerned, tourism and well, tourism wasn't affected, but certainly the economy was already on a downturn as far as downtown is concerned. Retailing has just changed. People just don't shop in brick and mortar stores. And I fear that now that so many are, everybody is shopping online now because the stores are closed. And some are even buying their food online. I think it's going to, even after everything opens up again, I'm not sure that a lot of people won't continue to shop online. And that it will become rare for people to go store to store looking, for a new sweater or a new pair of shoes or what have you.
So as you look ahead, as a planning commissioner, as someone who loves the city, it seems to me at City Hall there's sort of two camps. One is, we need to keep our head down in this emergency and incrementally move ahead. And then you have another chorus of people who are saying, no, we need to reimagine and re-envision the entire city and what we're going to be. Where do you sort of come down in that, in either of those two camps?
Well, because of this complete change in shopping, which is, interestingly enough, years ago, the Chamber of Commerce did manage to do a survey with people who were planning to come to Santa Barbara, people who had reservations, about what they planned to do when they came here. And then they did the survey again and said, what did you actually do? And what they planned to do was go to the beach, first of all, and then somewhere down, maybe a museum or two or what have you, and somewhere down the line it was shopping. What they actually did first was shopping. So, that's an important part of supporting the retail businesses in Santa Barbara. But as I said, this whole trend, the Amazon effect, and it's not just in Santa Barbara. It's all over, it's around the world. In England, high streets are shutting down. Major retailers are going broke for the same thing, even before the pandemic struck.
But what about?
So I'm in with the revisioning. Just what that would mean, I don't know. There has to be something else, like a public living room sense for downtown. Years ago, I suggested, having visited many cities with pedestrians, where main streets have been turned into pedestrian streets, and having visited Santa Monica, and it's very successful, 3rd Street Promenade, I suggested, I nearly got hung from a lamppost in La Arcata for having done so, that as a test program, on the weekends, we tried shutting down State Street. That had some communities had done this and in the wrong way, had created pedestrian streets that did not work well. And the owner of La Arcata in particular was familiar with one, and he was just totally freaked out by the idea. But I think that is something that should be explored and done.
And it looks like we're going to at least try that on a sort of an ad hoc basis, sooner probably rather than later. If I,
Yeah, well, we do it already for the farmers market
yeah, yeah.
one day a week.
And what about tourism? I was struck when you writing about the early years of planning in Santa Barbara, the Santa Barbara Civic League, again, at the early part of the 20th century. You quote a planner, Charles Mulford Robinson, um, who notes that the health of the city's economy depends on the enhancement of its attractiveness. So those two things have always sort of been joined. And again, I think that in 1973, you review some events that happened. But yet, one wonders how our tourism is going to survive in the era of the pandemic. Hotels are shut down, restaurants are shut down, and yet, yes, we're beginning to, I guess, dip our toe in the water of reopening. But is tourism really in our future?
I think so, simply because we are close to Los Angeles. In the past, at least, most of our visitors have come from the greater LA area. And when times are bad, instead of going off to Europe or such places, they come close by where it's inexpensive and they can drive. So I think that will recover.
Okay. One of the questions that I sort of ask every time I'm covering a political campaign in Santa Barbara, we have all of this debate about housing, which again, in your monograph, you point out has been going on for over a century, the same debate about housing.
Exactly.
But it seems to me that it's difficult to answer the question of how much housing and where the housing and what the cost of housing before answering the question of what population are we talking about? And there have been a number of times in the past, as you detail, when that question has very explicitly and specifically been posed. And for example, I guess it was in the 80s that there was a measure that people decided that 85,000 people was the optimum number in terms of the carrying capacity of natural resources, water, traffic, so on and so forth. When you hear this debate about, well, we need to accommodate the people who drive in from Ventura every day and down from Lompoc, what is your takeaway on that question? What should the population of Santa Barbara be?
Well, obviously, water is a key element, and there's simply Santa Barbara is, it's between the mountains and the sea. Montecito on one end and Goleta on the other, unincorporated areas, and we don't control what happens there. There just aren't the physical resources available, unless people want to overturn all this history of opposition to condominium towers and that sort of thing. But where will ultimately the water come from? We're tied into the state water project, which I opposed because it's most unreliable. We've restarted the desal plant because there was a major drought during my time as mayor, like 1989 to 1990, 1980, well, 1988 to 1992, in that period anyway. It wasn't as bad as this last one we had. Desalinating seawater is a source that's under our control. It's the only one that's not dependent on rain. There's climate change to consider, and there aren't the land and water resources to provide for a really big population. The downzoning that you were referring to in the decision about the 85,000 as the optimum population level, that actually occurred in 1975.
75.
Yeah. And was on the basis of, what our local resources are. Where are we going to put all these people?
Well, you think that's about right. I mean, we're at 89,000 now, about 89,000.
We're over 90,000 now.
There? Oh.
Yeah. And I'm the one who came up with the idea of the test program for the AUT, which is the average unit density, which was, increased density in certain parts of town as an experiment. Now, what I suggested was much smaller in scope and density as well than what the council finally adopted.
Why did you propose that originally, and how do you now assess that it's evolved and come out, the AUV program?
I suggested it because the city council was in the process of updating the general plan, and a majority of the council members seemed to be eager to just toss out go back to the zoning before 1975, and because the developers were all saying, if you up the density, we will be able to build affordable housing. And I suggested the test program sort of as a challenge in a way to the development community. Okay, if you really can, here's where you can try it and prove it. That's the way I was thinking about it. And I was rather naive in not realizing that rents would be what the market will bear. And I was really shocked when the first of these projects, which is the Mark project that's on the upper State Street next to what's now Target, and in the developers and the build development community, architects had a design charrette in which they said they could, if the densities went to these higher numbers, they could build units that rents would start at $1,200 and go up to $2,500. Well, the rents for the smallest units at the Mark started at $2,500 and went up to over $4,000. This is not the kind of housing we need. So in that respect, it has been unsuccessful. Originally, I have a copy, originally the way the ordinance was drafted, it included a provision for a percentage, 10% of inclusionary housing. That is, 10% of the units would have to be rented at a level affordable to moderate income households. And I have a copy of a letter that was signed by some of the development community to the council, urging that, among other things, that they take that provision out, that it would be too stifling, what have you. It was signed by, among other people, Jay Higgins, John Campanella, both on the plan. Well, Campanella was on the planning commission, Jay Higgins still is, and others who should have known better. And so I took a long struggle after seeing the problem. And actually, I was the one that created a sort of an ad hoc subcommittee that became the Housing Task Force that began to work on bringing a requirement for inclusionary housing into it, which the council now requires. But in the meanwhile, hundreds of units have been built or approved that are going to be market rate.
What about the changes that the council has made? Do you think that they will be able to significantly address the issues that have arisen from the original AUD program?
They will help, but let's face it, you have more housing units, you have more people living in town, you have market rate housing units, you have people with enough income to pay those rents, and they need services. They do. And so, and that is the basis for requiring the inclusionary housing. They create a demand for more services, creating a demand for more people with lower incomes to provide those services. And so it isn't, in the long run, I think we're still on the losing end.
So we've just seen in the last week, Nordstrom is closed, the last anchor tenant at Paseo Nuevo. And your comments, I think, are well stated about the decline of traditional retail. What do you think ought to happen at Paseo Nuevo now? We've just signed this 20-year lease, or about to, I guess, extension with the owners of the property to keep it as retail. Do you think there ought to be basically housing there, and that ought to be the thrust of the development?
Well, one of the things I suggested during the general plan update was that higher densities should be given to commercial properties that are developed entirely as residential. Commercial properties mean, if they're successful and are rented and occupied, mean jobs. Jobs mean people who need housing, create jobs that are not generally well paid. If it's all housing, it's for one thing, in addition, there is much less traffic generated. Well, somehow that never happened, although at least one of the council members thought it was a very good idea. So yes, turning it into housing would be preferable. Unfortunately, neither the Macy's nor the Nordstrom building is just something that you can take the existing structure and do. You've got to start over. And tearing it down would be, and those buildings down would be enormously expensive. My concern was what I see in terms of redeveloping downtown, which in my history, I explained back when zoning was first adopted back in the 20s, way more retail, way more commercially zoned land was provided than the community could support. And it was pointed out by the planning staff at that time, you're talking about enough commercial zoning for a city of 500,000 people. Well, I don't think there was anybody there then that thought Santa Barbara would ever grow to that size. And it was frankly a matter of greed on the part of the property owners. They thought it would make their property more valuable. Fortunately, we ended up with at least one piece of State Street between Mission and Alomar that is mostly residential. But it's just, it's too spread out. But in terms of turning it into residential, it's very, very costly. And I hope it happens. That would be a benefit. It would bring people downtown, living downtown, which would help support the businesses downtown.
Again, as you look back and researched and think about the various inflection points in the history of Santa Barbara, as you look at our situation today, and you and I are both under house arrest, more or less, because of the pandemic, and the economic activity has almost ceased. Are you hopeful about the future now? What are your thoughts about the future of Santa Barbara?
Santa Barbara is such a special place that I think it will manage to bring the tourism will come back, and that will help bring at least restaurants and some commercial back. Whether it can bring it back to the level that we would like to see, that I don't know. I don't know, but I'm somewhat optimistic.
Okay. Real quick, were you a supporter of district elections?
Absolutely not.
That's what I thought.
Oh,
And have your concerns been borne out as we've seen the council? We're not talking personalities here. I'm just talking as a matter of governance.
Well, just as a matter of governance, it is a very poor idea. After all, the decisions that the council makes every week, they affect the whole city, not just this part and that part, and so on. And if you're going to do any reasonable overall planning, you've got to think about the city as a whole. The problem with district elections is that people get elected from their district. They are therefore most attentive to their own district, and do not step back and take the broad view. They get reelected from their district, and so if they want to get reelected, that's what they do. It was really bad when Santa Barbara had it before. I think it was worse. I of course was very fortunate in all my years on the city council in that we didn't have district elections, but we also didn't have this politicization of the city council. Nobody cared.
Partisan politics?
Yeah, partisan politics. The Democratic Party wasn't involved at all in the way that it is now, and the Republican Party was sort of the way it is now, not terribly involved. And people on the council, they weren't thinking about what they were going to run for next. They weren't thinking about whether they were going to get party support or not. And they were all focused on what they individually thought was best for Santa Barbara. We didn't always agree because we didn't always think the same what the best would be. But we were very collegial and we got a lot of good things done.
Yeah.
And it's just, and on the national level, we have this terrible politicization in Congress where things don't get done, and this animosity, and nobody say, okay, forget that, forget the next election, be a statesman, or a stateswoman, and focus on the issues. That doesn't happen.
I have one more question. Before the last mayoral election, I asked you, and you were so kind enough to write an op-ed piece for newsmakers about the office of mayor, the office itself. Again, putting aside any personalities, we have a city administrator form of government in which the mayor essentially is one of 7 council members, but the mayor is also the only elected official now who is chosen citywide. I wonder if you have given thought to maybe changing the form of government and making the mayor a stronger position, having a mayor-led city rather than a city administrator, or do you think that we should? Okay.
Let's not politicize city management.
So you think we should stick with the form we have?
Yeah, there are some issues with the way it's operating right now, but I think it's far preferable to have a clear division between the council, which sets policy and which in the process does get involved in politics, and then the city administrator who carries it out. Now, I do have concerns about the way that is being done now. When I was in office, um, staff, if there were issues before of concern in the city, staff would look at them and they would come to the council and say, well, we could do this or we could do that or you do the other thing. And council would then say, well, we like this or we don't like that, whatever. You know, staff would be doing what I consider to be their job by, you know, they're the trained professionals and tell us, you know, say it was the fire department about high fire zones. The information needs to come from them. The council doesn't have it. Now, everything is, we don't do a thing unless the council tells us to. How is the council supposed to know what the options are if the professionals don't tell them? I think it's been a disaster. And
What's been a disaster?
well, as a way of running the city, you wait for a group to tell you what to do who doesn't, and you know, and I know in some cases staff was told, don't say anything except answer questions when they've made a presentation on an issue that's before the council. Council won't necessarily know what questions to ask.
Why do you think it changed?
Well, I think it changed because of the politicization of the council and of the city administrator being able to count to what a majority of the council is.
All right, well, we'll leave it there.
He or she can get fired on any Tuesday. Yeah, it's baldly that.
Okay, too much politics at City Hall.
Right.
No, and you know, the California Constitution clearly states that these local offices, city council and board of supervisors and so on, are supposed to be nonpartisan offices. And I agree with you that it's become entirely too partisan, and that the agendas, both personal and political, are not necessarily those of the most communitarian sensibility that we might see at City Hall.
Yeah, it works against a sense of community, which is something that Santa Barbara used to really have, where people they just cared about the community and were able to be involved in planning issues at the city and so on, you know, as organizations of Citizens Planning Association. And that just doesn't exist in the way that it did before.
All right. Well, we're going to be looking for publication of your monograph on the history of planning in Santa Barbara. And when is it coming out again? Scheduled this?
I've been told, yeah, that I've been told that it'll be published next month, but I need to check with the editor.
All right. Well, we will have you back when it comes out and take a tiptoe through the fields of history again. And well, thank you so much, Sheila Lodge, for joining us. You're such a
my pleasure.
You're such an important citizen to this town, and have done so much and know so much. A great resource for everybody. Thank you for joining us today.
You are most welcome.